How's everyone doing? Hope you're doing well and that your April reading is going along swimmingly. It's almost May, so even though I'm not a co-host, I want to do a little announcement video for the upcoming reading event, Horror Mayhem. Horror Mayhem 2026. Now, Horror Mayhem is a BookTube event, a reading event that was started several years ago by the bookish Bryants, Scott and Becky Bryant. Now, sadly, Scott Bryant is no longer with us. He sadly passed away. Becky Bryant is still continuing in his honor this event, and so are the other co-hosts and participants. So this is dedicated to Scott. Now, Horror Mayhem focuses on reading short horror fiction, 250 pages or less. So short horror novels or short stories, maybe short comic books or issues of comic books, etc. My BookTube channel is only slightly over a year old, and one of the first events, in fact, the very first BookTube event I took part in with my channel last May was Horror Mayhem. I like classic horror fiction generally. I don't read a lot of horror novels, although I'll try to read one horror novel, which I'll talk about later, for this event this year. But I had fun with this event. I read lots of short stories. Most of the short stories that I read in 2025 were for Horror Mayhem. So I'm happy and excited to join this event a second time. I will link the co-host below. There's some really cool people involved, like Gareth from Book Songs and Other Magic, Dave and Olive from Book Blather, Randy Ray, the Literate Texan, MJ, Reading This Life, and of course the great booktuber Michael K. Vaughn. Who else? I don't want to forget Greg, another bibliophile reads. Greg, who probably reads more than anyone else next to Steve Donahue, I think. Several other people I'm sure will join in. This is just, an impetus for me to get to some of my horror short stories and short fiction. Now, I did do a Horror Mayhem announcement video last year. You can go back and find it on my channel and in the playlists under Horror Mayhem. And I talked about several of the cool supernatural and ghost stories and horror and monster story collections and anthologies that I have. I'm not going to show those ones again, although I may dip into those again this year for what I'm reading. I also read some on Kindle. So I'll talk about those, depending on what I end up reading next month. I'll just want to show a few possibles, some things that arrived since last May in my collection. Some of these I've shown off before, in fact, probably most of them, or they were ones that slipped through the cracks when I did the announcement video last year, and I found them after the fact. So let me talk about these. I won't really differentiate, where I got them or when I got them or anything, but some of the books I might try to get to are collections that have stories in them. Again, focusing on short stories, novelettes or novellas or short novels. I'm going to read probably at least one story out of this, Ray Bradbury's The October Country. I haven't read a lot of Ray Bradbury's science fiction stuff, but I've always liked his horror stories. And he does a pretty good job with some pretty creepy stories. Now, he's a wonderful writer anyway, Bradbury. I'll give that to him. He's highly poetic and imaginative. He does write science fiction, and it's more soft science fiction, I guess you could say. But he's pretty hardcore in some of his horror stories, from what I recall. Now, I've read some of these in the past, but I'm going to try to grab some or read one or two that I haven't read before. So I'll just go through some of the stories that are in this collection. There's The Dwarf, The Next in Line, The Watchful Porkerchip of H. Matisse, Skeleton in the Jar. Those are really famous ones. The Lake, The Emissary. I have read The Emissary in the past. It's been a while. I think I read that one in high school even, maybe. Touched with Fire, The Small Assassin. That's another really good one. The Crowd, Jack in the Box, The Scythe, Uncle Einar, which I think is about a guy with some wings, if I remember correctly. The Wind, The Man Upstairs, There Was an Old Woman, The Cistern, Homecoming, and The Wonderful Death of Dudley Stone. And, this is a nice Del Rey collection. of this. I have this. I'm pretty sure I have another collection of this one in a more creepy covered version, but this is interesting cover anyway. And I'll dip my toes into that. Here's one that I've had for a while, but I think I forgot to show it last year. This is the Black Magic Omnibus, Volume 1. This is edited by Peter Haining. It's got a pretty gnarly, creepy cover on the front there. And of course, these are all stories about black magic. This is a Orbit book. Again, it's one of those nice British ones that opens really easily. Gotta like that. Really small print, though. Getting a little harder on these old eyes. Peter Haining is kind of a super editor. You know, he edited books on Doctor Who and M.R. James and all kinds of horror anthologies and other things. Shows here also edited by Peter Haining. The Ghouls 1, The Ghouls 2, Black Magic 2. Right? Anyway, this has some cool stories. This has a prologue by Dennis Wheatley, who doesn't, I don't believe he supplies any stories, but he does give a prologue because he's quite well versed in the occult. So we have The Salvation of Faust by Roger Zelazny, Transgressor's Way by Doris Perkin-Buck, don't know her, Lysandro's Familiar by August Derleth, The Liars in Wait by Manly Wade Wellman. You know, I'm going to be excited about reading some Wellman in this next month. Is The Devil a Gentleman by Seabury Quinn. I don't believe that's a Jules de Grandin story. I think that's probably one of his non-de Grandin stories. Monsieur Seeks a Wife by Margaret Irwin. The Rhythm of the Rats, Eric Frank Russell. The Magic Potion by Jerome Bixby. The Mirror of Cagliostro by Robert Arthur. The Dream Circean, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, by Aleister Crowley, noted black magic practitioner. The Primate of the Rose by M.P. Shiel. Witch's Hollow by H.P. Lovecraft. Got to have some Lovecraft in there. The Demon Lover by Shirley Jackson. April in Paris by Ursula K. Le Guin. And Cry Witch by Fritz Leiber. So pretty cool collection of stories in that one. This came out, when was this released? This was released in Great Britain in 1976 by Robeson Books, but this is a Futura edition. I guess Orbit puts out an Orbit book, Futura Publications, 1977. So some cool stories in there. I'm not huge on black magic stuff, but I do occasionally like to read and dabble, not in black magic, but in reading about stories regarding black magic. So I will read something out of there for sure. I have this kind of cool, it's an Academy Chicago Publishers edition of The Signalman and Other Ghost Stories by Charles Dickens. Now, I've had this one for a while. I must have neglected to pull it out last time. So there's the Chicago Publications logo. Academy Chicago Publishers, sorry. And this is one, it's kind of got one of those firm binding ones where you have a hard time opening it up. One of my old favorite haunts in Bellingham, Washington. I went to school at Western Washington University years and years and years ago in Bellingham, Washington, and one of the best bookstores in all of Washington State was there, Michael's Books. I don't know if it's still there, but I found the card of Michael's Books in this book, so that means I probably got it there. So, although it looks fairly like it was fairly new, this was published in 1988, and this has The Signalman, of course. This is a famous story about a signalman in a train. And again, most of these would have been written in the Victorian era. A Madman's Manuscript, The Bagman's Story, the story of the goblins who stole a sexton, the story of the bagman's uncle, the Baron of Grogswig, a confession found in a prison in the time of Charles II, To Be Read at Dusk, that's a cool title, I like that, The Trial for Murder, A Child's Dream of a Star, Christmas Ghosts, The Hanged Man's Bride, and Mr. Testator's Visitation. So it's a pretty slim book. It only has 138 pages in it. Each story may be around 10 pages or so, but, you know, fairly small print. Look at that tight binding. Ugh. Obviously, I haven't read this one much. I have read The Signalman, so I'd probably try another one. Of course, Charles Dickens is famous for one of the most famous ghost stories of all time, A Christmas Carol. That's not in here, but he has some other cool stories which I'd like to check out. Another one I've had for a while, I think I picked this up in Japan on some kind of book sale from Kinokuniya, but years ago when they had like a discount on some of these. This is 13 Phantasms and Other Stories by James P. Blaylock. Now, Blaylock is kind of a fantasy or weird fantasy / horror weird fiction writer. This one has, look at how thin that, this is a newer book too, and look at, it's not doing very well. It's barely hanging on to that cover there. It's all blackened inside. I don't know what heck happened to that. James P. Blaylock, what are some of his other works? I'm trying to think what else he wrote. But these are a collection of fantasy and horror stories, so I'll have to kind of decide which ones are more horror. But I would like to read something more modern, perhaps. In fact, coming off of April, the Outlaw Levi Wallace's kind of half joking, half tongue-in-cheek, half serious reading event, April, A-P-E, something featuring an ape. Hey, Levi. And this one, there's a story called The Ape Box Affair. I'll have to take a look at that one. But apparently it's 13 stories with the introduction by the author and an individual story copyright notes thing behind there. So, interesting. World Fantasy Award-winning author of The Rainy Season. So I guess that's one of his books. And even though he's persona non grata now, he's got a blurb from Neil Gaiman down below, who's written a creepy story of his own here and there. Okay, this is one of these cool Penguin Classics editions. I'd love to get some more of these. It's nice and heavy and well-bound. And this is Perchance to Dream Selected Stories, Charles Beaumont. Now, anyone who's a fan of the original Twilight Zone will be familiar with Charles Beaumont. Great writer of many wonderful and memorable episodes of the Twilight Zone. And this has a ton of stories in it, quite a few. And I haven't really read much of his fiction. I'm familiar with his work, like the Howling Man episode of the Twilight Zone and several others, very memorable ones. Charles Beaumont his unfortunate demise seems fitting for a horror story of its own. Poor guy, he suffered from some weird and seemingly undiagnosable, rapidly aging degenerative disease and died very young in late 30s with a wife and several kids. He was quite a mensch to other writers, a mentor figure. Seems like quite a guy. I'm sorry that he had to pass away so soon. Who knows what else he would have given us. A couple of these stories were adapted, I think, for the Twilight Zone. There's The Jungle in here, which is a really cool Twilight Zone episode. The Howling Man, of course, which I mentioned. There's several in here, some of them quite short, some of them longer. I'll try to get to one of those at least. Another one that I had last May, but I didn't show, I forgot that it was on my shelf, I guess, is one of these Wordsworth editions. This is The Witch of Prague and Other Stories by F. Marion Crawford. Now, F. Marion Crawford is famous for a couple of much anthologized horror stories. The Upper Berth is one, kind of a naval horror story, and that's in here, as well as For the Blood is the Life, a vampire story. This also has The Witch of Prague, which is an actual novel, which I won't be reading. It's a good 300 pages or so in the back of this. But some other stories in here, The Screaming Skull, Man Overboard, another much anthologized story, The Doll's Ghost, The Dead Smile, By the Waters of Paradise, and The King's Messenger. So all of those are roughly 10 to 20 page short stories. And then there's The Witch of Prague is the novel. So F. Marion Crawford is really fantastic horror writer from the classic era, kind of early 20th century. From the same time frame. I read one of his stories last year. I'll read it again. I don't know if I showed the book off in my announcement video in 2025 for Horror Mayhem, but I will this time. This is The Penguin Complete Ghost Stories of M.R. James, the finest purveyor of traditional British ghost stories who ever walked this earth. He's excellent at writing kind of very interesting ghost stories because they're not there's some really nasty kind of monstrous apparitions that, do not just appear, but, kill people and things. Very interesting. But the way James approaches it is very kind of prosaic. It's usually about because he was himself a, provost of Eton College for a long time, and he would share these stories over Christmas, the tradition of a ghost story for Christmas. He would write them and read them aloud to his fellows and students, etc., at this college. And they have a kind of donnish, kind of academic sort of feel in some ways, but they're very readable, very fun, kind of full of some kind of sly humor here and there, and sometimes really scary. So, especially in their conception. Now, this one, again, a lot of small print because you got to pack a lot of stories. He wrote quite a few ghost stories. He wrote several collections of ghost stories, and many of them are very famous. So last year I read The Haunted Doll's House, which was fantastic. And I'll read something that I try to read one. I've read almost all of his stories over the years since I first discovered M.R. James about 20, 25, 30 years ago. But I'll try to read some that I haven't read in a while. So I'll read at least one M.R. James story soon. Okay, that's a pretty cool, evocative little cover there. Two guys around a fire with the shadowy figure in the background there. Okay, last year one of the best horror stories I read was the Pickman's Model by H.P. Lovecraft. And so I'm thinking instead of just a short story, although with time constraints, I may only be limited to a short story. But again, this is just possibilities. I'm not going to guarantee that I'll read all of these, but I'm going to try to read H.P. Lovecraft's novel, At the Mountains of Madness. I've never read the complete novel before. I've read plenty of H.P. Lovecraft short stories or novelettes, but I haven't read that novel before. And I'm very curious about it. It's about expedition going down to Antarctica and uncovering all sorts of weird alien monstrosities in this kind of buried city under the ice. It's a very fascinating topic. Sometimes H.P. Lovecraft is a bit hard to get a handle on. There's a lot of thick vocabulary, etc. Some stories, like I read Pickman's Model last year, and it was, a breeze to read, and it was excellent and very creepy. So I'm going to give this one a try. This, At the Mountains of Madness, doesn't have very many stories in it because they're mostly novellas or novelettes. At the Mountains of Madness is around 130 pages in this edition. This is a cool, I believe, a UK edition of, who put this out? This is a Grafton Books. It's got a introduction by August Derleth, and it's got this pretty cool cover. It's a nice thick sucker. At the Mountains of Madness is kind of the first part of it. I'll try to get to that. Hearing Gareth and Dave talk from Book Blather and Gareth from Book Songs and Other Magic, I hopped on one of their live streams. Is This Thing On? They usually title it. And we chatted a bit about things, and they mentioned that they were going to try to read some comics maybe for Horror Mayhem. And I think I might join them in reading this Hellboy that I've had for a while. I probably read it before years and years ago, but I'd like to read it again. I love Mike Mignola's art and the original conception of Hellboy. It's really cool, vivid sort of artwork. And, it's fairly short. I don't know. It doesn't have page numbers, but I'm guessing it's, under 100 pages or so. Probably 70 or 80. And this is Seed of Destruction, the book that inspired the motion picture. Anyway, very cool art there, very evocative. And that will be a fun read. I've been trying to read more comics lately, as you might have noticed, slowly. I've always liked Hellboy, since I first discovered him, a couple decades ago. So that's always been a kind of interest of mine for comics, but I'm, not a diehard comics reader by any stretch. So I'm kind of easing my way into it with some various purchases. Another recent purchase, I love the Men's Adventure Library and also the Men's Adventure Quarterly stuff. Recently, earlier this month, I did a flip through of their Bigfoot issue of the Men's Adventure Quarterly. And I also had not too long ago finally got a copy of this Men's Adventure Library edition of Atomic Werewolves and Man-Eating Plants, When Men's Adventure Magazines Got Weird, edited by Robert Dice and Wyatt Doyle, with some really cool art. And there's some stories in here, which again usually have reproduced artwork in them. And, you know, showing some illustrations from Weird Tales, although these are not from Weird Tales. I want to stress these are from Men's Adventure Magazines, which kind of inherited the kind of mantle of the old pulps. When the pulps died out, the Men's Adventure Mags, the MAMs, Men's Adventure Magazines kind of took over. Here's an H.P. Lovecraft, Rats in the Walls. But I'll probably try to read someone that I don't know so well. There's a Theodore Sturgeon story in here, The Blonde with the Mysterious Body. Or there's one by, let's see, Jean Preen, Killer of the Cave, which is, I guess, the atomic werewolf. There's Steve Holland up there as the model for the atomic werewolf whose hands are transforming. What else do we got? There's a cool Manly Wade Wellman story in here. The Song of the Slaves. There's Trapped by a Man-Eating Tree. I might have to read that by Robert Moore. Trapped by a Man-Eating Tree. So, super cool cover, fighting a man-eating plant. I'm going to have to read something out of that. And finally, also got this last month, I believe, or thereabouts, maybe back in February. This is one of the Otto Penzler Big Book Ofs anthologies. Big, thick, fat, phone book size. Vampire Archives, the Vampire Archives. And this has just a ton of stories of vampires. Vampires are sometimes overdone. I don't always want to read vampire stories, but I'm going to read a couple out of here because I got this very recently, and also it's just got every single kind of vampire story you could think of. As usual, he breaks these into different categories. You have some forewords by Kim Newman and Neil Gaiman, and then a preface and a foreword, and then you have these different sections. Can you see that? There's these different sections that they break the contents in. And as usual, Otto Penzler, who's a very well-known editor and expert on crime fiction and horror fiction and adventure fiction, etc. He'll do a nice bio of each author before the story. So we have Pre-Dracula, which contains things like Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu is here, and The Tomb of Sarah by F.G. Loring, and Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe, etc. And then there's True Stories. There's a few of those. And there's Graveyards, Castles, Churches, and Ruins. So we got M.R. James and Carl Jacobi and Anne Rice and Tanith Lee and H.P. Lovecraft and Joseph Payne Brennan and Algernon Blackwood and Clark Ashton Smith. I mean, this contents pages just read like a laundry list of great horror writers, classic horror writers. Then we have That's Poetic. I guess they're poetry. Some poetry, a couple of poems. Probably won't bother with those. No offense to the poetry fans out there. Hard Times for Vampires. So we got, speaking of Charles Beaumont, we have Place of Meeting. We have an Ed Gorman and David J. Scow story. Classic Tales. So we have some E.F. Benson, Basil Copper, F. Marion Crawford, For the Blood is the Life. Again, that is a classic, much anthologized. No surprise it's in here. Manly Wade Wellman, When It Was Moonlight. I think there's a couple of Manly Wade Wellman stories in here, including Chastel, I think, which is one of my favorites. I did read this last year. What else? We have August Derleth, another M.R. James story. Algernon Blackwood again. Bram Stoker, Dracula's Guest. If you're going to have a Bram Stoker story, probably it's going to be either The Judge's House or Dracula's Guest, which is kind of excerpted from the novel Dracula, included in that kind of anthology. And he should be here, since he did write Dracula, he deserves to be in this. Another Clark Ashton Smith story. We have Psychic Vampires. So we have a story by D.H. Lawrence and Arthur Conan Doyle. Harlan Ellison, Something Feels Funny. I guess this means strange or maybe humorous or satirical. I'm not sure. We have a Frederick Brown story, no surprise. Stephen King, R. Chetwynd Hayes, Richard Matheson and Roger Zelazny in that section. Love Forever, we have a Lisa Tuttle story. Who else? Dion Fortune, Lafcadio Hearn. I always mispronounce his name. Lafcadio Hearn. The story of Chuguru. Lafcadio Hearn lived in Japan and collected a lot of Japanese ghost tales and translated them into English. Kaidan, or spelled Kwaidan quite often. There was a famous black and white movie made off of some of his stories. And then we have They Gather, which has a story by Steve Rasnick-Tem. Boy, I haven't read that guy in a while. I used to read him in story collections and anthologies, and back in the 80s quite a lot. Another Tanith Lee story, a Brian Stableford, and an F. Paul Wilson. So again, listen to these authors. So many well-known authors in here. We have another Arthur Conan Doyle story in the section, Is That a Vampire? Which is, of course, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, which is a Sherlock Holmes story. Being a Sherlock Holmes story, of course, there is no real vampire, but interesting nonetheless. That's a good story. I read that fairly recently for Holmes is Where the Heart Is in February. Let's see. We have a Sabine Baring Gold, M.R. James again, Clive Barker, Hubie Cave, Vernon Lee, Guy de Maupassant, another Fritz Leiber, The Girl with the Hungry Eyes. That's a very famous story. We have This Is War. So I guess this is wartime, war era vampire stories. We have one by Robert Bloch called The Living Dead, and Down Among the Dead Men by Gardner Dozois and Jack Dan. And then finally, Modern Masters. So we end with Brian Lumley, Ray Bradbury, Manly Wade Wellman, Peter Tremaine, Richard Lehman, Dan Simmons, Gahan Wilson. The Sea Was Wet as Wet Could Be is Gahan Wilson's story. Gahan Wilson's a little more well known for doing art, illustrations for Playboy and other various periodicals, but he also wrote books, children's stories, horror stories. And finally, to me, what seems in this day and age necessary, but still an impressive piece of work, almost 100-page bibliography of vampire stories, which of course I won't be reading for Horror Mayhem. But that's my pile of possibilities. Some cool stuff in there. If you've read any of these or have any recommendations out of what I've shown, or interest in what I've shown, or what you'd like to see me maybe read above the rest, please let me know in a comment below. Thanks for watching. Hope you get up to some fun reading for Horror Mayhem. Read something spooky, scary, things go bump in the night sort of story, and enjoy yourself, whatever you get up to in your reading life. Thank you and take care. We'll see you next time.